September 8th, 1755. A narrow military road, freshly hacked through old-growth forest, the southern tip of a lake the English have renamed only 11 days before. Down that road marches a column of 1,000 farmers, muskets on their shoulders, hatchets at their belts where bayonets should be. They are talking as they walk. They are not looking at the trees. And on both sides of that road, sunk into a rocky ravine that the forest hides completely, 1,500 men are crouched in absolute silence with their fingers on their triggers, watching the farmers come. Watch the distance close, 50 yards, 40. The men in the column can hear their own boots in the leaf litter. They cannot hear the 1,500 because the 1,500 are not making a sound. This is the last quiet moment these men will ever share. In seconds, the green on both sides of them is going to open up and turn a road into a slaughter pen, and it will be the first of 3. Because by nightfall, 3 armies will be destroyed. Not 1, 3. In a single turn of the sun. Think about what that means on this continent, in this year. 2 months earlier, one of the most formidable professional forces Britain had yet sent to North America, General Edward Braddock's regulars, drilled in the linear warfare of Europe, had been ambushed on the Monongahela and annihilated by a force a fraction of its size. The professionals had been butchered in the woods, and now, on the shore of Lake George, it would be the amateurs' turn to face the same enemy in the same trees. Farmers, shopkeepers, fishermen, men with no uniforms and no bayonets and no idea, most of them, how to stand in a battle line. By the end of that day, more than 200 of the enemy dead, most of them Canadians and their native allies, not French regulars, would be rolled into a stagnant forest pool until the water ran a deep, permanent crimson, a pond that carries the name Bloody Pond to this day. By the end of that day, a baron who had learned his trade on the great battlefields of Europe would be lying against a tree with 4 musket balls in his body, taken prisoner by a provincial who had no idea he'd just captured a general. By the end of that day, the myth that colonial farmers could not stand against the professional soldiers of a European crown would lie dead in the mud of upstate New York. And here is the strange thing. Almost no one remembers it. In the forest, the rules of Europe went to die. That is the single truth this entire day teaches, and everything that follows is a variation on it. On the open fields of Flanders and the Rhineland, war was a mathematics of lines, ranks and volleys, the disciplined machine of drilled men firing in unison, the bayonet charge that swept broken formations away. It was a science, and Europe had spent a century perfecting it. But that science assumed you could see your enemy. It assumed open ground. It assumed the man across the field was playing the same game you were. The North American wilderness assumed none of those things. Here the trees pressed in until a column of 1,000 men could not see 40 feet to either side. Here the enemy did not stand in a line. He lay in the brush, silent, patient, and he fired from cover you never spotted until the muzzle flash. Here the whole battle turned on a single currency, and that currency was sight. The army that saw first lived. The army that marched blind died. It was as simple and as merciless as that. On September 8th, 1755, 3 separate bodies of men would learn that lesson within a few hours of one another, and 2 of them would learn it far too late. This is the story of a day the forest did the killing. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a single day of fighting managed to destroy 3 separate armies in 3 separate slaughters, each with its own logic and its own horror. You'll understand why the most perfect ambush of the entire French and Indian War, a trap so well laid that a whole army should have vanished into it, sprang 3 seconds too early, and how those 3 seconds saved 1,000 men. You'll understand how a mob of farmers with no bayonets broke the finest grenadiers France could ship across an ocean. You'll see the exact moment a man stood up out of the brush and spoke a single sentence that unraveled a masterpiece. You'll meet the general who actually commanded the army through 5 hours of its most desperate fighting, and who was then deliberately erased from the official record by the man who took the credit and the knighthood. And you'll understand something larger than the battle. How one afternoon on a lakeshore in New York planted a seed that would grow 20 years later into a revolution. Because the men who walked away from Lake George walked away with a dangerous new idea about what they were capable of without the British Army standing behind them. This is not a battle about strength. Both sides had strength. This is a battle about seeing who saw, who was blind, and what the forest did to the ones who couldn't tell the difference. Before we step into it, if you find yourself gripped by the way this day unfolds, hit that subscribe button. It's the single thing that keeps this kind of long-form history alive. Now, Lake George, September 1755. To understand why 1,000 farmers were marching blind down a forest road that morning, you have to understand that they were the last piece of a plan that had already fallen apart everywhere else. The war that would engulf them had begun, as so many wars do, over a river and the money that moved along it. By the middle of the 18th century, 2 empires had wedged themselves against each other across the whole breadth of North America. France held a vast, thinly populated crescent of territory that curved from the mouth of the St. Lawrence through the Great Lakes and down the spine of the Mississippi to Louisiana, a geographic noose that hemmed the British colonies against the Atlantic coast and choked off their hunger to expand westward. Britain held the coast, dense, growing, populous, and increasingly furious at being penned in. Between them lay the interior, and the interior meant the fur trade, and the fur trade meant fortunes. Neither crown intended to share. The flashpoint came in the Ohio Valley in 1754. The record puts a familiar name at the center of it. A young Virginia militia officer, 22 years old, ambitious, and badly out of his depth, clashed with a French detachment at a place called Jumonville Glen, and then, cornered and outmaneuvered, was forced to surrender a hastily built stockade he'd christened Fort Necessity. The officer's name was George Washington, and this small, humiliating defeat in the deep woods was, in a very real sense, the opening move of a world war. No war had been declared. None would be, formally, until 1756. But both crowns understood what had happened, and both began pouring men and muskets into the continent's interior in a vast, undeclared mobilization. Here's where we should be honest about the sources, because this story is going to demand that honesty again and again. The neat causal chain, Washington fires a shot, and 8 years of global war follow, is the kind of clean line historians draw in hindsight. The men living it did not experience it as a single unfolding plan. They experienced it as a series of shocks, each one worse than the last, and by 1755, those shocks were coming fast. In London, the response to the Ohio crisis was designed by the Duke of Cumberland, and it was breathtakingly ambitious. Rather than wait for a declaration of war, Britain would decapitate New France before the fighting became official. A 4-pronged offensive that would strike simultaneously across the entire northern frontier and shatter French power at 4 points at once. It was the kind of plan that looks magnificent on a map in a warm room in a capital city 3,000 miles from the trees. The plan leaned on a mix of British regulars and something new: 3 separately raised provincial armies, drawn from the colonies themselves and referred to, in the language of the day, as American armies. That word matters. It is one of the reasons this battle would later be remembered, when it was remembered at all, as the day that destroyed 3 American armies. The phrase points 2 ways at once, and we'll come back to both. Watch the plan come apart. The western prong went first, and it went worst. General Edward Braddock marched a column of British regulars and Virginia provincials toward Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio, with all the confidence of a professional soldier who believed the wilderness was simply a badly organized version of Europe. In July 1755, a much smaller Franco-Indian force caught him near the Monongahela River and destroyed him. Braddock was shot through the lung and died days later. His men, drilled, disciplined, magnificent on a parade ground, had stood in their ranks in the trees and been shot to pieces by an enemy they could not see. It was the sight lesson written in blood, and it was written for the whole continent to read. But the Monongahela gave the French something worse than a victory. Among Braddock's abandoned baggage, the French discovered his correspondence, and in that correspondence, the complete operational plans for all three of the other British offensives, the entire grand strategy, laid open. The French Governor-General now knew exactly where every British blow was meant to fall. The northern prong, under Governor William Shirley, was aimed at Fort Niagara. It bogged down at Oswego, lost its momentum in supply failures and desertion, and was abandoned before it accomplished anything. The eastern prong, under Lieutenant Colonel Robert Monckton, struck at Fort Beauséjour in Acadia and actually succeeded. But that success curdled almost immediately into one of the darkest episodes of the war, the mass expulsion of the Acadian population, a tragedy whose shadow reaches far beyond this story. So by late summer of 1755, the magnificent four-pronged plan had become a catalog of disaster and stalemate. 3 prongs spent, and the entire weight of Britain's war in the interior now came to rest on the fourth and last, the central strike, aimed at the French fortress of Fort St. Frederick at Crown Point, and commanded by a man who had never fought a battle in his life. His name was William Johnson, and the French now held his war plans too. Before we meet the men, we have to understand the ground, because in this theater the ground decided almost everything. Look at a map of what is now upstate New York, and you'll see why armies here moved the way water moves, along channels, and only along channels. The forest was not scenery. It was old-growth wilderness so dense and so vast that dragging an army and its artillery overland through it was, for practical purposes, impossible. You could not march a European army cross-country here. You marched it along the water, or you did not march it at all. And the water ran in a single fateful line. From the St. Lawrence in the north, the Richelieu River fed down into Lake Champlain, a long finger of water pointing south like a blade. At its foot lay a portage to a second, smaller lake, the one Johnson would rename Lake George, and from there, another overland carry reached the Hudson River, which ran on down to Albany and eventually to the Atlantic and New York City. This corridor had a name among the people who fought over it for generations, the Great Warpath. Whoever held it held the door between Canada and the British colonies. It was the invasion route in both directions, and it had been soaked in blood for the better part of a century. At the northern end of that corridor sat the French fortress of Fort St. Frederick at Crown Point, a stone dagger aimed straight down the warpath into the heart of New York and New England. From Crown Point, French and Allied raiders had struck south again and again into the frontier settlements, burning farms and carrying off captives, and every colonial governor in the Northeast understood the fort as a permanent threat. Breaking that dagger was the entire purpose of William Johnson's expedition. Take Crown Point, and you rolled the French frontier back 100 miles and made the warpath a British road. That was the assignment. Take a fortress at the far end of a corridor that could only be traveled in single file through a forest that swallowed sight. It was a hard task for a professional. It had been handed to a fur trader. The Battle of Lake George, is unlike almost any major engagement of its war for one simple reason. On the British side, it was fought without the British Army. There were no red-coated regulars in Johnson's ranks. One lone British engineer accepted, and will come to him because he mattered enormously. This was a pitched battle between elite European troops and raw American citizen soldiers, and that fact alone would give the day its outsized meaning. But it also meant that the man in command was, by any conventional measure, entirely unqualified for the job. Major General William Johnson was an Irish-born immigrant who had come to the Mohawk Valley to manage a relative's estate and had made himself, through decades of trade, one of the most powerful men on the frontier. He was a fur trader and a landowner. He was shrewd, charming, ambitious, and utterly without formal military experience. He had never commanded troops in battle. He had never in any real sense been in a battle. So why did he hold the command? Because Johnson possessed something no professional soldier the British could offer had: the trust of the Iroquois. Over years of living among them, trading with them, learning their languages and their diplomacy, Johnson had become the single Englishman the Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy regarded as an honest intermediary. In a war where native alliances would decide who lived and who died in the forest, that trust was worth more than any officer's commission. Johnson's appointment was, in the plainest terms, political, but it was political for a reason that made sense. You do not send a man to fight in the woods without the people who own the woods. Johnson was the price of the Mohawks' goodwill. His army was some 3,000 raw provincial levies drawn from New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. Farmers, most of them, heavily armed and poorly disciplined. They wore no uniforms and carried no standard-issue weapons. A man brought whatever musket he owned, and many of them slung a hatchet at the belt, where a trained European soldier would carry a bayonet, a detail that sounds quaint until you remember what a bayonet is for. In the close, savage work of woodland fighting, a man without a bayonet is a man who cannot answer a charge with steel. It is a small absence that becomes, at the worst possible moment, an enormous one, and they did not even like each other. The provincial camp was riven with the regional animosities that would take another generation and a revolution to soften. The New Englanders, pious, plain, descendants of the Puritans, regarded the New Yorkers as profane and rowdy. Colonel Ephraim Williams of Massachusetts complained, in a line that has survived precisely because it is so human, that the New Yorkers spoke the language of hell. This was the army. 3,000 men who distrusted their neighbors, obeyed their officers unevenly, and were about to be asked to stand against the professional soldiers of a European crown. Johnson was not entirely alone in his inexperience. The practical military brain of the expedition belonged to his second-in-command, Major General Phineas Lyman, a Yale-educated tutor and lawyer from Connecticut, a man of the mind rather than the sword, but one who threw himself into the physical work of soldiering with a discipline the rest of the camp lacked. It was Lyman who drove the men to cut the roads and raise the fortifications. Hold on to Lyman. His name is going to matter twice in this story, once for what he did in the battle and once for what was done to him afterward. Leading the Massachusetts contingent was that same Colonel Ephraim Williams of the profane New Yorkers complaint, a member of the wealthy landowning families of western Massachusetts, sometimes called the River Gods. Williams seems to have gone north with a clear-eyed sense of the danger. Shortly before the campaign, he sat down and drafted a will, and in that will, he left his estate to found a free school. That school would, in time, become Williams College. Remember that because within days the man who wrote it would be dead on a boulder in a ravine, and the school would be his monument. And then there was the alliance itself. the reason Johnson held command at all. Johnson's mandate was to bring the Six Nations of the Iroquois into the war on the British side. He largely failed, and the failure was not his fault. The Iroquois were among the shrewdest diplomats on the continent, and they had watched Braddock's professional army get destroyed in July. They drew the obvious conclusion. Betting on the British in the summer of 1755 looked like a poor wager, and the Confederacy as a whole chose neutrality, the wise, cold calculation of a people who intended to survive whoever won. Only the Mohawks, bound to Johnson by decades of personal trust, came out in strength, and even then only in the hundreds. Somewhere between 200 and 300 Mohawk warriors joined the expedition, led by an aging and legendary sachem the British called King Hendrick, Theanogan. Here the honest historian has to pause because the sources tangle. There were two prominent Mohawk leaders known to the English as Hendrick across the first half of the 18th century, and history has spent a long time confusing them. One had crossed the Atlantic to be presented to Queen Anne in 1710. The Hendrick, who marched to Lake George, had visited the court of King George II in 1740. Popular retellings have long smeared the two men into a single, impossibly old figure. What matters for our story is the man who was actually there in September 1755. A veteran diplomat and warrior, old now, still sharp, serving as Johnson's chief tactical advisor and the crucial intermediary between the provincial command and the Mohawk fighters. His counsel would prove wiser than every professional judgment in the camp. His reward for that wisdom would be a French bayonet. That was the British Army at Lake George, a fur trader who had never fought, a lawyer who did the real soldiering, a colonel who had already written his will, 3,000 quarreling farmers without bayonets, and a few hundred Mohawk warriors led by an old king whose people had every reason to have stayed home. Against them was coming one of the finest soldiers in the French service and the professionals of a European army. On open ground, it would have been no contest, but this was not going to be open ground. This was going to be the forest. And in the forest, as these men were about to learn, none of that counted the way they thought it did. The army marching to meet Johnson was, in almost every respect, his opposite. Where his force was raw, theirs was seasoned. Where his was leaderless at the top, theirs was led by a professional. And where his knew the ground, theirs had just been handed a map of his soul, Braddock's captured plans, which told the French exactly where the British meant to strike and how weak they were at each point. At the head of the French force rode Jean Armand, Baron de Dieskau, German-born, a veteran of the great continental wars of Europe, a soldier schooled in the linear science that had just failed so spectacularly for Braddock. That irony sits at the center of this battle, and we should mark it now. Dieskau was a European professional walking into the same trap of pride that had killed a European professional 2 months before. He had learned his craft on open fields where discipline decided everything, and he believed, as such men believed, that disciplined troops properly handled could not be beaten by a mob. Armed with the intelligence pulled from Braddock's baggage, the French Governor-General had redirected Dieskau away from Lake Ontario and sent him down Lake Champlain to intercept Johnson's central strike. Dieskau moved fast. He reached Fort St. Frederick, pressed south to Fort Carillon, the post the English would later call Ticonderoga, and there made the decision that defines an aggressive commander. He left half his army behind and pushed forward with the other half, some 1,500 men, chosen for speed, to find the enemy and hit him before he was ready. Understand what those 1,500 men actually were, because they were not one army but 3 kinds of soldier bound uneasily together, and the seams between them would decide the battle. At the hard core were the Metropolitan Regulars, roughly 200 to 220 grenadiers, detached from the Régiment de Lorraine and the Régiment de Languedoc. These were the real thing. Professional European infantry, shipped from France earlier that year, drilled in the linear tactics of the parade ground and the pitched battle. Grenadiers were the elite of any European regiment, chosen for size and nerve. On the fields of Europe, they were magnificent. In the forests of North America, they were something else. Superbly disciplined men trained for exactly the kind of war they were about to discover they could not fight. They knew how to stand in a line and walk into fire. They did not know the woods. The bulk of Dieskau's force, around 600 men, were Canadians, the Troupes de la Marine, and the colonial militia, led by frontier officers who had spent their lives in this country. These men were the mirror image of the grenadiers. Hardened woodsmen, expert in the bush, masters of the ambush and the raid and the brutal art of the portage, they fought the way the land demanded rather than the way a European manual prescribed. They could see in the forest, and that made them worth more here than any grenadier. And then there was the third force, the largest, and, in the end, the most decisive, not through what it did, but through what it refused to do. Dieskau was accompanied by 600 to 700 native warriors from the 7 nations of Canada, a loose confederacy of Catholic mission communities along the St. Lawrence, drawing fighters from the Abenaki, the Algonquin, the Huron, and most fatefully, the Caughnawaga. And here, the story tightens into something close to Greek tragedy, because the Caughnawaga were Mohawks. Caughnawaga was a mission village of Mohawks who generations earlier had moved north to the St. Lawrence and taken up alliance with the French. They were Mohawks in blood and language and kinship, and the warriors marching south with Dieskau were about to collide in the deep woods with the other Mohawks, the 200 to 300 who had marched north with King Hendrik to fight for the British. Sit with that. The battle that was coming would set Mohawk against Mohawk, cousins against cousins, men who shared a language and a bloodline, arrayed on opposite sides of a European quarrel over a fur trade and a fortress in a forest that belonged to neither crown. The Caughnawaga knew they might have to kill their own kin, and that knowledge, not French tactics, not British artillery, would spring the greatest ambush of the war before it was ready, and change everything that followed. In this battle, the deadliest force on the field was grief. That was Dieskau's 1,500, 200 European professionals who could not see in the woods, 600 Canadians who could, and 700 native warriors carrying a wound that had not yet opened. A powerful army, a divided one, and divisions in the forest are fatal. Before the two armies find each other in the trees, it's worth stopping to understand exactly why they were about to fight two completely different kinds of battle in the same place. Because the collision of those two ways of war is the engine of everything that follows. The European way of war, the way Dieskau's grenadiers and Braddock's regulars had been forged in, was a science of the open field. Picture it. Long lines of men, shoulder to shoulder, 2 or 3 ranks deep, advancing in step across ground you could see for a mile. On command they halt, they level their muskets, and they fire in unison, a wall of lead delivered all at once, because a single smoothbore musket was wildly inaccurate, and only massed volleys made it deadly. Then, into the smoke and the shaken enemy line, the bayonet charge. Rows of steel points at a dead run, sweeping the survivors away. It was a machine made of men, and it demanded 3 things: flat ground, clear sight, and an enemy willing to stand in the same kind of line and play the same game. Given those 3 things, it was the most efficient killing method on Earth. Europe had spent 100 years proving it. The woodland way of war assumed the exact opposite of all 3. There was no flat ground. There was forest. There was no clear sight. There were 40 feet of green and then a wall of leaves. And there was no enemy standing in a line, because why would he? The warriors of the northeastern nations and the Canadian woodsmen who had learned from them fought a war of the ambush and the raid, what the French themselves called la petite guerre, the little war. You did not announce yourself with a volley. You lay silent in cover. You let the enemy come to you. You fired from concealment at a target that could not find you, and if the odds turned, you melted back into the trees and were simply gone. It prized patience, marksmanship, mobility, and above all sight, seeing without being seen. It regarded a massed frontal assault on a prepared position not as brave, but as insane, which is precisely why the Caughnawaga would refuse to make one twice in a single day. Now, put the two ways of war in the same forest and watch what happens. The European machine, dropped into the trees, loses all three of the things it needs. Its lines cannot form among the trunks. Its sight collapses to nothing. Its volleys fire into brush at enemies who aren't standing there. And its greatest strength, the disciplined refusal to break, to hold formation no matter what, becomes the thing that gets it killed, because a formation is exactly what the hidden guns want to shoot into. That was the Monongahela in July. That would be the Portage Road in the afternoon. The very training that made these men magnificent was the training that walked them in perfect order into the muzzles. And here is the cruelty of it, the detail that decided so much, the bayonet. On a European field, a soldier without a bayonet is only half a soldier. He cannot answer a charge, cannot hold in the close press when the volleys stop. Johnson's provincials mostly had none. They carried hatchets instead, in a stand-up European battle that would have doomed them. But in the forest, where the fighting was scattered and behind cover and there was no massed bayonet charge to answer, the absence mattered far less, and the hatchet, the tomahawk, the close, brutal tool of woodland fighting, mattered far more. The weapon that made a provincial useless on a parade ground made him survivable in a ravine. Two ways of war, then, walking toward each other through the same trees. One built for sight and open ground, marching blind into a place that had neither. The forest was going to decide which one it liked, and the forest had already made up its mind. Through August of 1755, Johnson's army had hauled itself north from Albany, dragging wagons and cannon through the old-growth timber at a pace that would seem impossible to a modern eye. Under Lyman's direction, they built as they went. On the east bank of the Hudson, at the vital 15-mile portage between the river and the lakes, the crossing the traders called the Great Carrying Place, they raised a fortified supply depot, first named Fort Lyman, later renamed Fort Edward. Hold both names in mind. The fort is going to sit at the hinge of everything, and the sources will call it by both. Leaving Lyman and a garrison of some 500 men to finish the works, Johnson pushed north with the main body. On August 28th, he reached the southern tip of a lake the French had known, with Catholic reverence, as Lac du Saint-Sacrement, the Lake of the Holy Sacrament. Johnson renamed it on the spot. He called it Lake George, after his king, and in the naming he planted a flag of English dominion over water the French had blessed. It was a small act of possession, and like so much on this frontier, it was premature. Here Johnson made his first real error, and it was an error of sight. He established an unfortified camp on the lakeshore and settled in to wait for the boats and artillery that would carry him on to Crown Point. He believed, with no good evidence, that the French were purely on the defensive, that the danger was ahead of him at Crown Point and not around him in the trees. His supplies lay strewn openly across the beach. His camp had no walls. He was operating on an assumption, and the most dangerous thing a commander can do in the forest is assume, because assumption is a kind of blindness that feels like knowledge. While Johnson waited on his open beach, Dieskau was already moving to get behind him. Rather than come straight down the lake into Johnson's face, Dieskau landed his 1500 at South Bay and marched them east and south along Wood Creek, swinging wide around Johnson's camp to strike instead at the soft target, the supply lines, and the fort to the south. It was a raider's instinct, and a good one. Cut the enemy's throat from behind at his weakest point where he isn't looking. On the morning of September 7th, Mohawk scouts brought Johnson the first hard evidence that his assumptions were wrong. They had found a wide, freshly cut road near South Bay, the unmistakable signature of a large body of men moving through country where no such road should be. Something big was in the woods, and it was moving toward Johnson's rear and toward Fort Lyman. Johnson did the correct thing. He sent a rider south to warn the garrison, a New York militiaman named Jacob Adams, carrying dispatches through the dark forest to raise the alarm. And here, the forest took its first life of the campaign, and, in taking it, handed the French a gift. Adams was intercepted and killed. His dispatches were captured, and from those papers, combined with the seizure of a mutinous supply train, Dieskau learned the one thing that would set the whole tragedy in motion. Fort Lyman to the south was strongly held and defended by artillery, while Johnson's main camp at the lake, holding the bulk of the army, had almost no defensive works at all. The intelligence pointed like a finger. Don't attack the fort with the cannon, attack the open camp. But Dieskau did not command an army that simply obeyed. He commanded a coalition, and coalitions argue. He called a council of war, intending to strike Fort Lyman. His native allies, the Caughnawaga foremost among them, flatly refused. Their refusal was not cowardice, it was doctrine, and it was sound. In the warfare of the northeastern nations, throwing warriors against a fortified position bristling with cannon was near suicidal folly. Artillery slaughtered men in the open without giving them the thing their whole way of war depended on, the chance to strike from cover and slip away. To attack a fort with cannon was to trade lives for nothing, and no experienced warrior would spend his people that way. They would not do it. So Dieskau pivoted. If the fort was too hard, the camp was soft. He turned his army north up the Portage Road to fall on Johnson's exposed encampment at Lake George. The forces of the day were now set on a collision course, and neither commander yet knew that the other had changed his mind. Dieskau was marching north toward a camp he thought was undefended. Johnson, at that camp, still believed the French were miles to the south, laying siege to his fort, two armies moving blind toward each other through the same trees. The forest was about to introduce them. On the morning of September 8th, William Johnson held his own council of war and made a decision that nearly destroyed his army, and would have, if not for an old man and a handful of sticks. Johnson still believed the French were investing Fort Lyman to the south, so he proposed to send help, 500 men south to reinforce the fort and another 500 east toward South Bay to burn the French boats and cut off their retreat. On a map, it looked prudent. 2 detachments, 2 objectives, a pincer. It was exactly the kind of tidy plan a man draws when he cannot see the enemy and does not truly grasp what he is facing. King Hendrik grasped it. The old sachem rose in the council and opposed the division of the force with everything he had. And then he did something that is echoed for 2.5 centuries, because he made his argument not in words alone, but in a demonstration a child could understand and a general could not ignore. He picked up a single stick. He snapped it in half without effort. Then he gathered a bundle of sticks, bound them together, and held them out, and no man in the council could break them. 1 stick breaks. The bundle holds. Divide your force, and the French will snap each piece over their knee. Keep it whole, and it cannot be broken. Then he spoke the line that has outlived nearly everyone else in this story. Warning that the proposed detachments were at once too large to lose and too small to win, Hendrik said, "If they are to be killed, they are too many. If they are to fight, they are too few." It is one of the finest pieces of military wisdom ever recorded on this continent, and it was delivered by a man the English condescended to call king in a council of amateurs about a danger none of them could yet see. Johnson listened. To his credit, he changed his plan. He consolidated the two detachments into a single relief column, 1,000 provincial troops and 200 Mohawk warriors, and gave it to Colonel Ephraim Williams with orders to march south to the relief of Fort Lyman. The bundle had held. Hendrik had won the argument, and that precisely is the tragedy, because Hendrik had fixed the wrong problem. He had made sure the column would march whole. He had not made sure it would march seeing. And in the forest, 1,000 men marching blind together are not a bundle of sticks that cannot be broken. They are a single fat target that cannot get out of the way. At 9 o'clock in the morning, Colonel Ephraim Williams led his column south down the crude military road, and almost everything about how he led it was wrong. He did not throw out scouts ahead. He did not post flankers in the trees to either side. King Hendrik himself rode near the head of the column, the man who understood this forest better than any officer present, and still the thing that should have happened did not happen. 1,000 provincials and 200 Mohawks marched in a dense, close-packed mass down a narrow road through virgin timber, guns on their shoulders, certain the enemy was miles away to the south. They were loud. They were bunched. They could see the road in front of them and the backs of the men ahead of them, and nothing else. The trees on either side were a green wall, and behind that wall, anything at all could be waiting. This is the sight lesson again, and it is worth stopping on because it is the whole hinge of the morning. An army in the open can afford to be a little blind. It can see danger coming across a field and form to meet it. An army in the forest cannot. In the forest, your eyes are your scouts and your flankers, the men you push out ahead and to the sides to walk into the ambush before the main body does, so that when the trap springs, it springs on a handful and not on everyone. Williams marched without eyes. He marched 1,000 men into country where he could not see 40 feet, trusting an assumption. And 3 miles south of the lake, in a rocky ravine, the forest was full of men who had done nothing all morning but see. Warned by a deserter that the British were coming down the road, Dieskau had laid a masterpiece. He set his French grenadiers across the road itself, a wall of professional infantry to block the column's head and stop it cold. Then he sent his Canadians and his native allies deep into the trees on both flanks, curling them forward along the sides of the ravine into a great U, a horseshoe of hidden guns opening toward the approaching British. The plan was pitiless in its precision. Absolute silence, fingers off triggers. Let the head of the column march all the way into the mouth of the U until the vanguard struck the grenadiers at the far end, and then the two arms of the horseshoe would close, and 1,500 men would fire inward from 3 sides at once into a packed mass that had nowhere to go. It would not have been a battle. It would have been an erasure. The entire relief column, a third of Johnson's army, swallowed whole in a ravine and never seen again. It should have worked. Every element was in place. The British were marching blind into the exact center of it, and then, in the last seconds before it closed, the trap sprang itself, because you cannot silence grief. As the head of the British column pushed deep into the ravine, a Caughnawaga warrior crouched in the brush, looked out at the Mohawks marching in the British vanguard, and saw his own people, not strangers, not enemies. His kin, Mohawks of the 5 nations, cousins in blood and language, walking straight into a horseshoe of guns that he was part of. And he could not do it. He could not lie in the leaves and pour fire into his own relations without so much as a warning. So he stood up out of the brush in the last quiet moment, and he called out across the ravine, "Of what nation are you?" From the British column, the answer came back, "We are Mohawks in 5 nations. Of what people are you?" And the Caughnawaga pleaded with them, "Stand aside, step out of the way, let the French destroy the English, and let no Mohawk blood be spilled by Mohawk hands." It was one sentence, spoken out of love, and it detonated the finest ambush of the war. Because the instant a voice rose out of the silent trees, the vanguard knew. The trap was blown. Surprise, the entire currency of the plan was gone in a single breath. And on both sides, men who a heartbeat earlier had been holding their fire now had no reason left to hold it. The French Allied forces opened up, and the ravine came apart. A devastating fire tore through the provincial ranks from both sides of the road at once. The old accounts reach for the same image every time, and it is the right one. The thickets blazed and the men fell by scores. Point-blank musketry from cover into a bunched column that could not see where the shots were coming from. There was no line to form, no field to maneuver on, nothing to charge, only the road, the trees, and the muzzle flashes winking out of the green on every side. The leadership of the column was gutted in the opening minutes. King Hendrik, the old sachem whose wisdom had bound the army into a bundle that could not be broken, had his horse shot from under him. Aged and heavy, he could not get clear, and as he struggled to rise, a French bayonet found him. The man who had warned Johnson not to divide his force, who had seen more clearly than any officer in the camp, died in the leaves of a ravine he had not been able to prevent them from entering. The forest took the one man who understood it best, Colonel Ephraim Williams, the same Williams who had complained of the New Yorker's profanity, who had written a will to found a school, tried to do what a commander is supposed to do. He climbed a large boulder of gray guineas to see over the chaos, to find the shape of the fight, to direct a flanking move that might save his men. For one instant, he had what everyone else in that ravine lacked, a vantage, a view, sight, and it killed him. Rising above the smoke made him a target, and a musket ball struck him in the head and killed him instantly. He had gone up the rock to see, and seeing cost him his life. Even the men who tried to open their eyes in that place died for it. His men hid his body in the brush to keep it from mutilation and buried him near the field. And there is a quiet completion to his story that the ravine could not touch. The will he had drafted just before marching north endowed a free school in western Massachusetts, and that school became Williams College. The man died in the leaves of a forest he had led his soldiers into blind. The bequest he left behind outlived the battle, the war, and the empire it was fought for. His death was even folded, in some early versions, into the mocking little marching tune that would follow the colonies into their revolution. Yankee Doodle. History does not always end with dignity. Now and then, it ends with a schoolhouse. Deprived of Williams and Hendrik in the first minutes, the column did what leaderless men under crossfire do. It came apart. The disciplined mass dissolved into a screaming, chaotic melee of point-blank gunfire and the close, terrible work of the tomahawk and the scalping knife. The bloody morning scout, as the survivors would name it, was tipping over the edge from ambush into massacre. That it did not become a total massacre is owed to a handful of officers who kept their heads when everyone had reason to lose them. Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Whiting of Connecticut and Lieutenant Colonel Seth Pomeroy gathered a rear guard, perhaps 100 provincials in the surviving Mohawks, and did the hardest thing in all of warfare. They retreated without breaking. Firing from behind trees in the native fashion, using the forest at last the way it was meant to be used, they covered the flight of the panicked militia and bled the pursuit at every step. They had learned the lesson of the morning in the only school that teaches it. Now they fought from cover, unseen, and made the French pay for every yard. And in that retreat, the provincials struck a blow that mattered far beyond its moment. They killed Jacques Legardeur de Saint-Pierre, the respected commander of Dieskau's native allies, a veteran frontier officer whose authority held the coalition's fighters together. His death rippled backward through the pursuing force. The Canadian and native warriors, suddenly leaderless at the head of the chase, slowed. The pursuit lost its edge and its coordination, and that hesitation, bought with the life of one French officer, gave the shattered remnants of Williams's column the few precious minutes they needed to flee the several miles back toward the lake, back toward the camp, back toward the guns. The First Army was destroyed. 1,000 men had marched south at 9 in the morning. A broken, bleeding fraction of them ran north now, carrying the news that the enemy was not miles away at the fort. The enemy was right behind them and coming fast. That was the price of marching blind. One column gutted in a ravine in the span of a morning, and the day was not yet half over. Step back from the noise for a moment, because the most important thing that happened in that ravine was not tactical. And if we rush past it to get to the guns, we miss the true center of the whole day. Mohawks killed Mohawks in that morning fight. Understand what that actually was. The Iroquois Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations, was one of the most sophisticated political structures on the continent, and in 1755 it was doing something entirely rational: staying out. Its leaders had watched Braddock's professional army destroyed in July, and they had drawn the sober conclusion of a people who intended to outlast this war, no matter who won it. Betting on the British looked foolish. Betting on the French meant abandoning generations of alliance with the English colonies, the old covenant chain. So the Confederacy as a whole chose the wisest and coldest path available: neutrality. Let the two European crowns bleed each other. The nations would survive by refusing to spend their young men on someone else's quarrel. Only the Mohawks broke that consensus, and only because of one man, Johnson, and the decades of trust he had built. 200 to 300 Mohawk warriors marched north with King Hendrik against the judgment of the wider Confederacy, and they marched to a horror the Confederacy's caution had been designed to avoid. Because waiting for them, in French service, were the Caughnawaga, Mohawks of the mission villages on the St. Lawrence, who had moved north generations earlier and allied with France. Same nation, same language, in many cases literally the same families, split across a border drawn by empires that had never asked them. So when the ambush went off, it was not simply French against British. It was, in the leaves of that ravine, Mohawk firing on Mohawk, cousin on cousin, one branch of a divided people killing another branch over a European fur trade and a European fort. The Caughnawaga warrior who stood up and called, "Of what nation are you?" was not being a poor soldier. He was refusing, for one impossible second, to be the instrument of that. He was trying to save his kin from his own guns. And it is a measure of how the whole day was rigged against these people that his mercy is exactly what turned the ambush from a clean erasure into a chaotic slaughter that killed Mohawks on both sides anyway. This was, by any honest reckoning, one of the darkest days in Mohawk history, and it is the part of the story that the European records handled worst. Both commands had every reason to undercount the native dead, and both did. The men who took the credit and the knighthood and the land grants wrote the dispatches. The people who buried their own cousins wrote nothing that survived in the archives that mattered. The battle we remember, faintly, as a plucky colonial victory was for the Mohawks, a fratricide that helped break their strength on the northern frontier and ended their participation in the campaign entirely. The guns are about to open up again at the camp, and we'll follow them, because that is where the victory was won. But keep the ravine in view. The loudest fighting of September 8th happened at the barricade. The deepest wound happened in the trees, quietly, between men who shared a language and almost no one bothered to count it. Back at the lake, William Johnson heard it before he understood it, a rolling thunder of heavy musketry echoing down through the forest from the south. He did not need a messenger to read that sound. Williams's column had walked into disaster, and whatever was left of it was being driven back onto him. In perhaps 2 hours, the men who had destroyed the relief column would arrive at his open, unwalled, supply-strewn camp. So Johnson did the one thing that could save him. He ordered his men to build a wall out of whatever they had, and to do it now. What happened in the next 2 hours is one of the underappreciated feats of the whole war. 3,000 raw provincials, the same quarreling farmers who couldn't agree on whether the New Yorkers spoke the language of hell, tore their own camp apart and rebuilt it into a fortress. They felled trees and dragged them into a breastwork. They overturned the supply wagons and shoved them into the line. They hauled the bateau up from the shore and turned the boats themselves into barricades. It was improvised, ugly, and thrown together in a panic, and it was exactly enough. Try to stand inside those 2 hours. The sound told the men everything. The musketry from the south had been a distant thunder at first, then closer still, and mixed into it now the first survivors of William's column staggering out of the forest, bloodied and wild-eyed, carrying the news in their faces before they could speak it. Every man hauling a log knew what that approaching noise meant. The thing that had just butchered 1,000 of their own was coming here, and the only question was whether the wall would be finished first. There is a particular terror in building your own defense while you can hear your death getting louder, and these were not soldiers steadied by years of drill. These were farmers, some of whom had never heard a gun fired in anger before that morning. And yet the strangest thing happened in those 2 hours. The camp that could not agree on anything, the pious New Englanders and the profane New Yorkers, the men who spoke the language of hell and the men who judged them for it, stopped quarreling and started digging. Regional animosity is a luxury of safety, and safety had just evaporated. Under Lyman's driving, under the lash of that approaching sound, 3,000 men who had distrusted each other for weeks became, for the length of an afternoon, a single, frightened, working thing. The wall rose because the fear made brothers of them, at least until dark. It would not last past the campaign, but it lasted long enough. And at the center of it, Johnson placed the thing the French allies had feared from the very beginning, the thing that had turned them away from Fort Lyman the day before: artillery. 3 field cannon positioned to sweep the road in the open clearing that any attacker would have to cross to reach the barricade. Those guns were served under the direction of Captain William Eyre of the 44th Regiment of Foot, the one British regular officer in the whole army, a trained military engineer, the lone professional among the amateurs. It is one of the quiet ironies of Lake George that the American victory turned at its hinge on the skill of the single Englishman present. Eyre knew what artillery could do to men in the open. He was about to demonstrate it. Now the two forces faced each other across a clearing, and the whole logic of the battle inverted. In the morning, the British had been the ones marching blind into a trap. This afternoon, it would be the French who charged across open ground into the muzzles of guns they should have refused to face. The forest had switched sides. The hunters had become the hunted. Dieskau meant to finish it. The plan was obvious and aggressive: chase the fleeing survivors right into the camp and overrun the position before the British could recover their nerve. Ride the panic through the barricade. It was the correct instinct, and it might even have worked if he had still commanded an army. But at the tree line, looking out across the clearing at the raw log breastwork and the mouths of 3 cannon, Dieskau's coalition came apart in his hands. The Caughnawaga refused. They had spent the morning killing and burying their own kin in that ravine. They were sick with it, and they had just lost Saint-Pierre, and now they were being asked to charge, in the open, into artillery, and they knew, many of them, that more of their Mohawk relatives were inside that very camp. Every instinct of their warfare and every bond of their blood said no. They would not do it. The Abenaki and the Canadian militia, watching the Caughnawaga balk, made the same calculation and reached the same answer. They would not walk into grapeshot in the open for a European baron's pride. Instead, they melted away into the woods and swamps on the flanks of the camp and settled in to do what they knew how to do: long-range sniping from cover, largely ineffective against a fortified line, but safe. And so Baron de Dieskau found himself, in the decisive moment of the battle, abandoned by 5/6 of his army. The Canadians would not charge. The natives would not charge. He had 600 or 700 woodsmen and warriors who had just declined sensibly to commit suicide, and he had 220 European grenadiers who would do whatever he ordered. Here was the moment that defined him, and it defined him exactly as it had defined Braddock. Frustrated, humiliated, his coalition dissolving, Dieskau reached for the only thing he trusted: European doctrine. He would show these colonials and these wavering irregulars how real soldiers took a position. He formed his grenadiers into a tight, disciplined column, shoulder to shoulder, the parade ground machine, and he ordered them to march straight down the Portage Road into the open clearing, directly into the teeth of Ayer's 3 guns. It was the single worst decision on the field that day, and it was made by the most professional soldier on it. That is not a coincidence. It is the whole lesson of the war, delivered twice in 2 months. The training that made these men magnificent in Europe was the exact thing that walked them, in perfect order, into the muzzles of the cannon. As the grenadiers stepped out of the tree line and into the sunlight, their white uniforms bright against the green, Ayer's gunners were waiting, and they were not firing solid shot. They were firing grape shot, canisters packed with musket balls and scrap metal that turned each cannon into an enormous shotgun. Against a single man, a cannonball is almost wasteful. It kills one and buries itself in the earth. Against a tight column of men in the open, grape shot is apocalyptic. Each blast sprays a cone of iron across the whole face of the formation, and a formation is precisely what Dieskau had given them to aim at. The guns opened up, and the effect on the packed ranks has been captured, in a phrase the historian Fred Anderson drew from the accounts, in words that have never been improved on. The artillery cut lanes, streets, and alleys through the French column. Read that again, and see it. Not gaps, streets. Whole rows of men swept away at a stroke, opening avenues of empty air through a formation that a moment before had been solid. And still the grenadiers came on. This is the terrible dignity of those professional troops. They held their formation and kept walking into fire that was annihilating them, because that was what they had been trained to the marrow to do. They fought with astonishing bravery. It availed them nothing. Discipline is a weapon, but on that road it was pointed the wrong way. Early in the exchange, William Johnson, the fur trader, the political general, the man whose name would go on all the dispatches, was struck. A musket ball caught him in the hip, or by some accounts the buttock, and he was bleeding badly enough that he had to be helped back to his tent for treatment. Whatever else it did, that wound removed him from command of his own battle at its climax. For the next 5 hours, the general in the tent was not the general on the line. Command fell to Major General Phineas Lyman, the Connecticut lawyer, the man of the mind, the officer who had done the unglamorous work of the whole campaign. And Lyman rose to it completely. For 5 hours he rode his horse back and forth along that improvised barricade, in the open, under the fire of the French snipers in the trees, directing the volleys, managing the artillery, holding 3,000 terrified farmers to their work by the sheer visible fact of his own steadiness. It was Lyman who actually commanded the Battle of Lake George through its longest and most dangerous stretch. It was Lyman who held the line. Remember that clearly, because it is about to be taken from him. The French assault could not break the barricade, and it began to consume itself. Dieskau, at the front, urging his grenadiers on, was struck 3 times in the legs and refused to leave the field. Unable to stand, he had his men prop him against a tree in sight of the British lines so that he could keep directing the battle from where he had fallen. It is an image out of an older, harder code of war. A wounded baron, 3 balls in his leg, seated against a tree, still commanding. Whatever we make of the decision that put his men in front of those guns, the man himself did not flinch. But bravery cannot restock a cartridge box. As the afternoon wore on and the French ammunition ran low, the assault crumbled. The surviving grenadiers and the irregulars in the woods began to fall back, disorganized now, toward the ravine where the morning's ambush had been sprung. And the provincials, the farmers, the amateurs, the men who had been running for their lives at 9 that morning, leapt over their own barricade and went after them. Some of them came upon a wounded man propped against a tree in a general's coat. According to the story Dieskau himself later told, he reached into his pocket for his watch, meaning to hand it over as a captive's gesture, and the soldier, seeing a wounded enemy officer's hand dart toward his coat, thought he was drawing a pistol and fired. The ball passed through Dieskau's hips and perforated his bladder, a 4th wound, and the one that would eventually kill him, though it would take 12 years to do it. Only then did the provincials grasp that they had just shot and captured the commander of the French army. They carried him to Johnson's tent, and there the day produced its one moment of grace. Johnson, himself wounded, lying with a ball in his hip with every reason to want revenge, learned that his Mohawk allies, wild with grief over the death of King Hendrik, meant to execute the captured baron then and there. And the fur trader, who had never fought a battle before that morning, intervened personally to save the life of the enemy general who had spent the day trying to destroy him. In a war defined by massacre and mutilation, William Johnson stood between a helpless prisoner and the men who wanted him dead and held them off. The Second Army was destroyed. Dieskau's grenadiers, the professional corps of the French force, lay in streets and alleys of their own dead on the Portage Road, and their commander was a prisoner in the enemy's tent. 2 slaughters in one day in 2 directions, 1 British column erased in the morning, 1 French column shattered in the afternoon, each destroyed by the same forest that punished whoever crossed the open ground with their eyes closed and their formation tight. And even now, with 2 armies down and the sun sinking, the day was not finished. 14 miles to the south, a colonel at Fort Lyman had been watching smoke rise over the mountains all afternoon, and he had already sent men north to see what it meant. They were about to walk into the 3rd slaughter. There is a ghost standing behind Baron de Dieskau on that Portage Road, and its name is Braddock. 2 months. That is all that separated the 2 disasters. In July, General Edward Braddock, a career British officer, brave, competent, decades in the service, had marched his regulars into the woods near the Monongahela and been destroyed by a smaller force fighting from cover because he could not imagine a battle that did not follow the rules he had spent his life mastering. In September, Baron de Dieskau, a career soldier, brave, competent, decades in the service, formed his grenadiers into a column and marched them across an open clearing into 3 cannon, because he could not imagine a battle that did not follow the rules he had spent his life mastering. Different armies, different flags, the same trap, the same death, made of the same pride. This is worth dwelling on, because it is the deepest lesson the battle has to teach, and it is not really about tactics at all. It is about the specific blindness of the expert. Both Braddock and Dieskau were, by the standards of their world, superb. Neither man was a fool or a coward. Dieskau took 3 balls in the legs and kept commanding from against a tree. He did not lack nerve. What both men lacked was the ability to believe that their own excellence could be the thing that killed them. The training that had won them their reputations had also built a wall around their imagination. Presented with a situation their doctrine did not fit, they did not adapt to the situation. They forced the situation into their doctrine, and the forest killed them for it. Set that against the amateurs. Johnson had never fought a battle in his life, and precisely because he had no doctrine to defend, he did the humble, adaptive thing when the guns thundered in the south. He threw up a wall of logs and wagons and boats, whatever was to hand, and he pointed his cannon at the open ground. He did not do it because a manual told him to. He did it because it obviously worked. Lyman held the line for 5 hours, not through European drill but through sheer presence and nerve. Folsom and McGinnis at Bloody Pond won by setting exactly the kind of ambush the French had set that morning, learning the forest's lesson in a single day and turning it back on its teachers. The provincials had almost nothing the professionals had. What they had instead was the freedom to improvise, and in the woods that turned out to be worth more than a lifetime of drill. Modern soldiers still study this, and not because muskets and grape shot have any bearing on their world. They study it because the pattern never dies. Again and again, across every century, the powerful and the professional walk into the country of the weak, convinced that superior training and superior numbers are the same thing as certain victory. And again, an enemy who has read the ground and refused the powerful army's game makes those advantages irrelevant. The specific weapons are obsolete the moment they're forged. The trap is eternal. It caught Braddock in July and Dieskau in September, and it has caught someone in almost every war since, because arrogance is renewable and institutional memory is short. Dieskau, propped against his tree with his men dying in streets around him, was not beaten by better soldiers. He was beaten by a forest that did not care how good he was, and by his own inability to believe that mattered. That is the professional's trap. It is still open. It is always open. And it is still swallowing commanders who march in certain that the rules they learned somewhere else will hold here too. 14 miles south, at Fort Lyman, Colonel Joseph Blanchard had spent the afternoon reading the sky. He could not see the battle, but he could see its smoke drifting up over the mountains, and he could hear, faint and low, the rumble of artillery rolling down through the hills. He didn't need the details. Guns meant the camp at the lake was under serious attack, and men were dying up there while he sat behind his walls. So Blanchard did what the whole day had punished other men for failing to do. He sent out eyes. He dispatched a relief force of roughly 120 men to march north and find out what was happening. An 80-man company of New Hampshire provincials under Captain Nathaniel Folsom, and a 40-man company of New York provincials under Captain William McGinnis. And it is worth naming the regiment those men came from, because of who was serving in it. Blanchard's New Hampshire regiment, the one that garrisoned Fort Edward and furnished this relief party, counted among its captains a 23-year-old frontiersman named Robert Rogers, commanding its ranger company. It was here, in this very Lake George campaign, that Rogers' skill in the woods first brought him to William Johnson's notice, and within months that reputation would earn him command of the independent ranger corps that bears his name, Rogers Rangers, who would write the template for a distinctly American way of fighting in the forest. The wilderness that punished European doctrine was, in the same season, schooling the men who would one day master it. Around 4 o'clock, as Folsom and McGinnis pushed up the military road, they came upon something unexpected. The French baggage train, left lightly guarded in a ravine beside a stagnant forest pool about 2 miles south of the lake. The provincials fell on the guards and scattered them, and then Folsom and McGinnis did the thing that separates soldiers who have learned the forest's lesson from those who have not. They did not simply seize the baggage and move on. They understood that the French retreating from the disaster at the camp would come back this way, drawn to their own supplies, and so they set an ambush of their own. They faded into the dense tree line around the pool, and they waited, unseen. It was the exact reverse of the morning. In the ravine at 9 o'clock, the British had marched blind into a hidden enemy. Now, at the pool at 4 o'clock, it was the French who came stumbling toward men they could not see. Shortly after 4, some 300 exhausted, demoralized Canadian and native survivors of the failed camp assault straggled back into the area, wanting nothing more than to rest and recover their packs. They had been marching and fighting since before dawn. They had been shattered at the barricade. They were beaten men looking for their belongings. They walked straight into the kill zone. And the New Hampshire and New York provincials, hidden in the trees, opened up with what one account called a well-directed and galling fire. There was no fight left in the French survivors. The provincials poured a relentless crossfire into them from cover until darkness fell, breaking whatever cohesion remained and driving the survivors from the field entirely. Folsom lost only 6 men. Captain McGinnis was mortally wounded and would die shortly after, the price, small in numbers and total for him, of the third slaughter. And when it was over, the provincials held the entire French baggage train and vast stores of ammunition, which meant something larger than the bodies on the ground. The French army had lost the ability to sustain itself. You cannot campaign without your powder. Bloody Pond took it. The Pond. The name came from what they did next. More than 200 of the slain, Canadians and their native allies for the most part, rather than French regulars, lay around that stagnant forest pool, and the living rolled the dead into the water. An impromptu grave for a mass of men there was no time and no will to bury properly. The sheer volume of it stained the water a deep, lingering red, and the place kept the name the day had given it. Bloody Pond. It's still called that. 2.5 centuries later, you can stand beside a small, quiet pool in the New York woods and know that it earned its name in a single afternoon when the third of 3 armies was destroyed on the shore of it. 3 slaughters. 1 day. The bloody morning scout at 9, the wreck of the grenadiers at the barricade through the long afternoon, and Bloody Pond at dusk, 3 separate destructions of 3 separate bodies of men, each one turning on the same brutal question of who saw whom first, all of it compressed into a single revolution of the sun over one small corner of the wilderness. When the killing stopped, both sides did what armies always do after a bloodletting. They lied about the cost. Casualty reporting at Lake George was famously inaccurate and thoroughly politicized because every commander was writing for a crown that measured him by his losses. The numbers that survive have to be handled with care, and the honest version of this story admits that up front. The British provincials lost somewhere in the range of 150 to 216 killed, roughly 100 more wounded, and a number captured, a total of perhaps 300 to 380 men. The Mohawks, who had marched 200 to 300 strong, lost dozens killed, with a plausible figure of 40 to 80 or more, a catastrophic proportion for so small a force, and one that almost certainly was undercounted because the Mohawk on Mohawk dead of the morning ravine were the kind of loss both European commands had every reason to leave out of their reports. On the French side, the regulars were gutted. A letter written that October by the French official Doré reckoned that the grenadiers of Lorraine and Languedoc had lost more than a third of their strength killed and wounded in the charge on the barricade, with more taken prisoner, Dieskau among them, and the Canadians and native allies added well over 200 more casualties. Here, the record offers one strange, almost eerie detail worth pausing on. The historian Ian K. Steele, working through the competing claims, noted the near-perfect symmetry of the official losses, something like 331 total casualties on the British side against 339 on the French. Two armies, a continent from home, fighting a chaotic three-part battle across 14 miles of forest, and they bled, on paper, almost exactly the same amount. It is the kind of symmetry that feels like it should mean something, and probably means only that both sides shaped their numbers toward the same politically convenient middle. But the true weight of the day fell where the paperwork was thinnest, on the Mohawks on both sides, who buried their own kin in that ravine and were counted carefully by no one. If you want to understand what 18th century war actually cost the men who survived it, follow the Baron. Dieskau lived, which his physicians regarded as very nearly a miracle. 4 gunshot wounds, 3 in the legs and the devastating 4th through the hips and bladder. Johnson treated his captive with conspicuous respect, assigning his own camp physician, Dr. Peter Middleton, to the prisoner and asking that he be given the best care possible. In mid-September, Dieskau was escorted down to Albany. The officer entrusted with seeing him comfortably settled was a young captain of the New York militia named Philip Schuyler, who would himself become a famous general of the Revolution. And there, the war produced one more small, astonishing act of grace, one Dieskau recorded himself. Among the women of Albany who nursed him was one whose own husband had been killed in the very battles his army had fought, and she concealed her grief so completely and tended him so kindly that the wounded general said he never once saw her sorrow or felt himself a burden to her. Hold that beside the image of Johnson shielding the prisoner from the Mohawks' knives. In the middle of a war defined by fratricide and mutilation, a handful of people kept deciding to be merciful, even, in her case, to the man whose soldiers had made her a widow. It did not change the strategic map by an inch. It is, all the same, the part of the story most worth remembering. Dieskau's suffering, though, had barely begun. Moved to New York City under the care of another physician, Dr. John Jones, and then shipped across the Atlantic as a high-value prisoner of war, he spent years seeking relief for the groin wound that would not heal, enduring the medicine of his century in the baths at Bath, which is to say, bloodletting, cauterization, and the slow excising of foreign matter from a wound that stayed open. From England, he wrote letter after letter to an indifferent French government, detailing his condition and pleading for the compensation his sacrifice was owed. He remained a prisoner until 1763, when the war ended, and he was at last exchanged and allowed home to France. And there, in 1767, on the 8th of September, 12 years to the very day after a frightened provincial fired a musket into him beside a lakeshore in New York, Baron de Dieskau died of complications from that Lake George wound. The forest had killed him after all. It had simply taken its time. Johnson had won. He held the battlefield. He had captured the enemy commander, and by every hard measure of the 18th century that made him the victor. And yet the victory was strangely hollow, and what grew out of it would matter far more than the battle itself. Johnson's army was wrecked in spirit even where it had triumphed. The loss of King Hendrik and so many Mohawk warriors, one of the darkest days in Mohawk history, effectively ended Iroquois participation for the rest of the 1755 campaign. Johnson himself was wounded, his supplies were thin, and autumn was closing in. So he gave up the original objective. Crown Point, the whole point of the expedition, the stone dagger he had been sent to break, would not be taken. Instead, Johnson ordered Captain Eyre, the engineer whose guns had saved them, to design a proper fortress on the site of the camp defense. Completed that November with timber and earth walls 30 feet thick, it was named Fort William Henry. And here, the battle reveals its longest shadow. The French answered Fort William Henry by building their own great fortress at the northern end of the lake, Fort Carillon, which the English would later call Ticonderoga. In a single season, the Lake George corridor had frozen into a militarized, fortified frontier, 2 stone fists a day's travel apart. That frozen frontier was the stage for what came next, the infamous siege and massacre at Fort William Henry in 1757, and the enormous, bloody Battle of Carillon in 1758. The Battle of September 8th did not end the fighting on the Great Warpath. It built the ground on which the worst of it would be fought. Now the debt comes due, the one this story has been carrying since the afternoon Phineas Lyman rode the barricades for 5 hours while Johnson lay in his tent. When William Johnson wrote his official dispatch to the Crown, he praised his troops warmly and at length, and he did not mention Phineas Lyman, not once. The man who had actually commanded the army through the entire camp defense, who had held 3,000 raw farmers together under fire while the nominal general was being treated for a wound in the hip, was written out of the account of his own greatest hour. It was a scandalous omission, and everyone who had been there knew it. The reason was ambition, and it worked. Johnson leveraged the victory brilliantly. He secured a bounty of £5,000 and a baronetcy from King George II. He walked off the field the fur trader who had never fought a battle and became, by act of the Crown, Sir William Johnson. The New England troops, loyal to Lyman and already primed to resent the New York command, were furious at what they rightly saw as a self-serving theft of another man's credit. And Lyman himself, he spent 11 years pursuing land grants in England as compensation for service the official record refused to acknowledge, and he died at last in near poverty in West Florida. The man who held the line got the grave of a pauper. The man in the tent got the knighthood. The forest is indifferent to who deserves what, so it turns out, is history's paperwork. But the day left one more thing behind, and it was arguably the most important of all. A sutler attached to the provincial army, a camp merchant named Samuel Blodgett, had watched the battle, and afterward he drew it. A detailed bird's-eye sketch of the camp defense and the Morning Scout. Engraved by Thomas Johnston in Boston and published that December, Blodgett's image became the first historical print ever produced in America. Sit with what that means. The first time the American colonies made a picture of their own history to show to themselves, the history they chose was this battle. Colonial farmers with no British regulars beside them, standing off a European army and winning. The print showed the public what it called the American method of bushfighting, and it functioned as exactly what it was, propaganda and a mirror. Because the deepest consequence of Lake George was not the fort or the frontier or even the captured baron. It was an idea. 2 months earlier, Britain's finest regulars had been slaughtered at the Monongahela. Now, an army of farmers, shopkeepers, and native allies, with a single British officer among them, had thrown back a French invasion and captured its general. Historians have argued, and it is hard to disagree, that the battle planted the psychological seeds of rebellion. It proved to the provincials that they could organize, fight, and win a major engagement without the British regular army holding their hand. 20 years before Lexington, the men of the colonies watched themselves do something they had been told they could not do. And it was a school as much as a symbol. Robert Rogers, marching to Bloody Pond in his first action, Israel Putnam, another future name of the Revolution, these were men learning, in the ravines and swamps of Lake George, the irregular way of war that would one day be turned against the very army whose place they had taken here. The forest that punished European doctrine was teaching a new kind of soldier. The seed went into the ground on September 8th, 1755. It would take a generation to break the surface. So here's the question the whole story has been circling. Ask 100 people to name a battle of the French and Indian War, and most will manage none. Ask them for the day 3 armies died on a single lakeshore, and you will get silence. Why did one of the most consequential and genuinely astonishing days of the whole war vanish so completely from memory? Part of it is the shape of the victory. Lake George did not take Crown Point. It settled nothing on the map. It turned a fluid frontier into a fortified stalemate. Battles that decide things, that topple a capital or shatter an empire, get remembered. Battles that end in a wall of logs and a French fort built in answer tend to slip away, however brilliant the fighting. Part of it is that the drama here is the wrong kind for legend. The genuinely decisive elements of the day were unglamorous: a failure to post scouts, the physics of grape shot against a packed column, a supply train captured at a pond. The most cinematic moment, a Caughnawaga warrior standing up in the brush to warn his kin, is a moment of mercy and tragedy, not heroism, and it worked against the side that won. The day resists the clean, flattering story that keeps a battle alive in a nation's memory. And part of it, frankly, is whose story it was. The heaviest losses fell on the Mohawks, on both sides of a European quarrel, and the men who wrote the histories were not much interested in a Mohawk tragedy. The general who actually commanded was erased by the one who claimed the glory. Even the name that survives is a stolen one, Sir William Johnson's, while Lyman died in poverty and Hendrick died in a ravine, and the bathhouse of the Caughnawaga grief goes nameless in most retellings entirely. History remembers the men who wrote the dispatches. It forgets the ones who held the line and the ones who buried their cousins. The wonder is not that Lake George faded. The wonder is that we can still reconstruct it at all, through Blodgett's sketch, through the competing casualty ledgers, through the accounts of the officers who survived the ravine. It waits there in the record, this forgotten slaughter, for anyone willing to walk back into it. There is one more thing to settle before we leave the lakeshore, and it is the phrase itself, the one that names this whole story. The day that destroyed 3 American armies. It sounds like the kind of dramatic overstatement these tales reach for. It is not. It is true on 2 levels at once, and both are worth seeing clearly. The first level is the one we have just walked through. 3 distinct destructions in a single turn of the sun. The relief column erased in the morning ravine. The French grenadiers shattered at the barricade through the afternoon. The beaten survivors annihilated at Bloody Pond at dusk. 3 separate bodies of men, 3 separate slaughters, 3 separate lessons in the same brutal grammar of the forest. Not one battle, but 3, stitched together by a road and a day. But the phrase points a second way, outward, at the whole shape of 1755. And this is the meaning most retellings miss. Britain's grand plan that year had unfolded along 4 fronts, and 3 of them were built around newly raised provincial American armies, men drawn from the colonies themselves rather than shipped from Europe. The northern prong under Shirley marched toward Niagara. The eastern prong under Moncton struck into Acadia, and the central prong was Johnson's own, committed to the interior. Only the western prong, Braddock's, was led by British regulars, with Virginia provincials salted through the column. By that autumn, the fate of the American provincial soldier had been written across the entire frontier in a single season. Braddock's mixed force annihilated in the west, Shirley's provincials stalled and abandoned in the north, Moncton's succeeding in the east at a cost that curdled into the Acadian expulsion, and Johnson's bled white in a 3-part slaughter here at the lake. The whole colonial military effort of 1755 had been fed into the wilderness and chewed up, front after front, plan after plan. And that is why the day matters more than its inconclusive map. Because out of that year of provincial armies destroyed, out of Braddock's captured plans and Shirley's stalled advance and the bodies in Bloody Pond, the colonies took something the Crown never intended to give them. They learned at terrible cost, that the British system could not keep them safe, that professional doctrine died in these trees, and that when the regulars failed, farmers behind a wall of overturned wagons could still throw back a European army and capture its general. 3 armies were destroyed in a day, and 3 provincial armies were spent in a season, and from that wreckage, the provincials salvaged a dangerous confidence in their own hands. The armies were destroyed. The idea they left behind was not. It was just beginning. We began on a road, a thin thread of order hacked through primeval forest, and a column of 1,000 men marching down it with their eyes closed. That is where the story starts, and in a sense it is the whole story, because everything that happened on September 8th, 1755 happened because of who could see and who could not. 3 armies died that day. The relief column in the morning ravine, blind, bunched, marching to the sound of its own boots into a horseshoe of hidden guns. The French grenadiers in the afternoon clearing, brave and disciplined and utterly doomed, walking in perfect formation into streets of grapeshot because their training would not let them do anything else. And the beaten survivors at dusk, stumbling back toward their own baggage and into one more ambush beside a pool that would take their name and their blood and keep both. 3 slaughters, 3 lessons, the same lesson 3 times. In the forest, the army that sees first lives, and the army that marches blind dies. And the men who paid for those lessons are mostly gone from memory now. King Hendrik, who understood the forest better than any general in the camp, who bound the army into a bundle that could not be broken, and then died in the ravine he could not keep them out of. Ephraim Williams, who climbed a rock to see and was killed for the seeing, and whose will built a college that outlived his stolen skull. Phineas Lyman, who held the line for 5 hours and got a pauper's grave for it. The Caughnawaga warrior, who could not fire on his own people and spoke one sentence out of love that unmade the finest ambush of the war. History kept the fort and the knighthood and the map. It let the rest go. But something did survive that day, something larger than any of them, and it did not go into the ground with Hendrik or sail to England with Dieskau's wound. On one impossible afternoon, a mob of farmers with no bayonets and no uniforms and no love even for each other stood behind a wall of overturned wagons and broke a European army, and then made the first picture of their own history to prove to themselves it had happened. They walked off that lakeshore carrying a dangerous idea about what they were, an idea that would take 20 years and a revolution to finish. The seed of that was planted in the blood of Lake George. The pond is still there, small and quiet in the New York woods. No monument marks where the relief column died, or where Lyman rode the barricade, or where 200 men were rolled into the water until it ran red. The road has long since grown over, but the lesson waits there all the same, the way it always waits, for any army arrogant enough to believe that discipline is the same thing as sight, that numbers are the same thing as victory, that it can march 1,000 men down a forest road with its eyes closed and trust the trees to be empty. The trees are never empty. That is the whole of it. In the forest, you see first, or you do not see the man who kills you. 3 armies learned that in a single day on the shore of Lake George, and then the world, as it does, forgot.